What's going on, everybody? It's Boo from Mile Hi Distilling. I'm really happy to present what we've got going on this week. This is going to be part one of a huge series. This is going to be our Distilling 101 series. So we're going to be talking about everything under the sun. We're going to be talking about fermentation, distillation, aging of spirits, bottling, labeling, all different types of things throughout the course of this series. And it's going to be pretty long. Even fermentation alone, which I'm starting with today, probably going to be a 2, maybe even 3-parter. There's just a lot to cover. And I want to begin through really just talking about the literal 101 basics. We're going to be talking about things like how things started, how things work, how fermentation actually works, mash versus wash, and things to consider. As we proceed through there, we'll talk about different fermentation types for making the desired spirit you're looking for. And then from there, we'll talk about yeast and the yeast we need to create these spirits. Where they're going to go into equipment and getting you the right setup to ferment and distill like you want. We'll talk about fermentation methods. And then we'll also talk about stuck fermentations, because that can be a real thing. In fact, I would say out of maybe 40, 60% of people I talk to on the phone daily, weekly, with problems, a lot of their problems have to do with fermentation. It's just a finicky one. There's a lot of variables. So hopefully that section helps you become a better distiller, better fermenter, I guess. Before we actually proceed to this video, I do need to take a second. It has been a hell of a week for me. I'm going to need a shot, okay? I hope if you guys have one, you'll take it with me. This was actually the bourbon we made with Balmer Peak Distillery a few weeks ago. It's very smooth. We named it Bourbon the Burbs. It's a bourbon for the working class man, made by the working class man. Enjoy. Anyways, enough fooling around for me. Let's get started on this video, okay? What better place to start than literally how things started with fermentation? This would be a little bit of story time mixed with some actual factual documents and different things. Unfortunately, as far as I could see, there's not really a recorded first fermentation ever, right? Because fermentation, it's a natural process. This has been around for thousands of years, okay? Before we even knew what was going on. We had trees that would bear fruit, and as they fell to the ground, you have wild yeast found in fruit and sugars found in fruit. That's all you need to create fermentation. And that's actually where humans began to understand, well, more like they began to experience what alcohol was. They eat this fruit back in our primal days. I mean, pretty much our ape brethren, and they'd get drunk off it, right? And that's how we started to develop the tolerance we have for ethanol. We're one of the only species in the animal kingdom that has that tolerance. A lot of other animals and mammals can't process. So, lucky us, right? And then way down the line, past those primal days, when we began to be more civilized, we would store fruit and meat, things that could perish, in cool spots for the summer to prepare for the winter. Let's just say, in the case of this story, let's say we store, someone down the line stored a barrel worth of fruit in a cave. Now, give it a few years, and let's say this bucket of fruit was forgotten about. Come in a few years later, and it's found again, but there's something off about it, something different. It's got a different smell to it, different taste. There's probably a little bit of foam and different things going around. And you know how humans are, we're inquisitive. We want to know what's going on. They probably did a million things with it, probably bathed in it, probably threw some in the sky to try to appease some god. We probably did a shit ton with it. And one of those things we likely did was drink it, and notice it made us feel really good. So, more or less, that's as far back as history goes in Storyland. Now let's get down to the actual facts, right? The first recorded process of fermentation was around 10,000 BC, and it was actually fermented camel milk. We took camel milk, fermented it, and that was really just to make it last longer. It wasn't really for drinking purposes, as far as I know. However, we go down the line, and we're going to see records of wine being created in as early as 5,000 BC, I believe, somewhere in China. And as we progress even further, when science started to take a little more hold of things, biology, chemists started coming up and trying to experiment with these things. There was a French chemist who found acetic acid in milk, and that was sort of, in a way, sort of the findings of what fermentation actually is and what it's doing to create an alcohol. Now, how things work is pretty cut and dry. We have yeast, which is living, the same as we are. Anything living needs to breathe, and anything living needs to fuel up and feed on something to survive. And yeast primarily eats two things, oxygen and sugar. That's sort of how it gets along. Let's say you have a bucket and you have yeast in it, and you put sugar on top. Well, that is technically what a fermentation is, but if that bucket is kept open and oxygen can enter, the yeast doesn't really have any fight or flight mentality, no survival kicking in. It can just continue to, infinite supply of oxygen and not really worry about anything. And when a lid goes on top of that bucket, which is basically cutting off the oxygen supply to the yeast, over time, the yeast runs out of the oxygen. It's life intelligent enough to say, hey, I need to somehow continue to survive. So it feeds off the sugar. It eats the sugar in order to continue to fuel and continue to thrive and grow its colony. Now, in that process, carbon dioxide is released. As the yeast eats the sugar, carbon dioxide flows up. And what will happen is when oxygen cannot enter the bucket, but carbon dioxide can exit the bucket, in that process, alcohol is created. Now, any more how beyond that is unfortunately outside of my knowledge as well. I'm not really a chemist. I'm an amateur one, but I don't really know how that process works and what sort of chemical reaction is going on there. But that's simply how alcohol is created. And that's why your airlock sitting on top of your fermentation vessel, when you see it bubbling, that's actually carbon dioxide getting out of that bucket. That's why it bubbles. And so now that we sort of have a little bit of an understanding on where, I guess, alcohol came from, as well as, how alcohol is being created through this fermentation process, we need to start getting into the nitty-gritty and understanding more about fermentation as far as it relates to distilling. Now, one of the very first things you need to understand is what a mash versus a wash is. And that answer is also very simple. Mash is basically a fermentation made out of anything solid. Fruit mashes, grain mashes, and then a wash is made out of anything liquid. So sugar wash, which is just sugar, water, yeast. You could also have a molasses wash, molasses, water, and yeast, and things like that. As far as things to consider in the fermentation process, we have three things that are the biggest factors. We have to first understand yeast and what type we need to get our best results. We have to also consider a location where we're planning on distilling, because there's a lot of variables. We don't want things to get too hot. We don't want things to get too cold. We don't want to have things sitting out to where things can turn volatile and ruin your fermentation. And then, of course, another thing is sizing. Let's say we have an 8-gallon still. Well, it does make sense to get an 8-gallon vessel so that one batch in your fermentation vessel equals one batch in your still. But it's not always the right way to go. Some people like to double batch, which we'll talk about a little later. And we can go as crazy as, quadruple batching and have enough for 4 batches in our fermentation vessel, be done in a week, and just keep on pumping through the still every day for a full week. So let's begin to go a little more into that as we proceed. Let's begin talking about fermentation types. We have our list of pretty general spirits. Those include vodka, gins, rum, whiskey, tequila, and brandy and schnapps. They're sort of interchangeable in a way. Then aside from that, there's also a lot of specialty spirits. There's spirits that, all around the world are sort of just delicacies and different things. Dunder is a type of rum, usually in the Caribbean. We have Malort, which is like a Chicago delicacy. Absolutely insane spirit. I got a chance to try it last week, and holy hell, Anyone who's done the lore knows what I'm talking about. We have shochu and soju in different parts of Asia. Everyone really knows cognac. And things like absinthe, which I'm sure you guys have heard of as well. Very specific spirits for the process. But if we were to begin through some basic spirits, let's start with vodka. Vodka is made up usually of one of three things. Everyone knows potato vodka. It's a very traditional way to go for your vodka. Gives it a really nice mouthfeel, interesting mouthfeel when it's done right. Grains are also a pretty well-known technique for vodka. I've seen a lot of wheat vodkas, some rye vodkas. It's really up to you. And sugar is a very cost-effective and easy way to make a vodka. Sugar, water, and yeast. You're not worried about any sort of flavor coming over with a vodka, so you can use something very neutral in flavor as your base, like sugar. And since you're not really worried about volatiles or how taste carries over too much, you can use a turbo yeast or something really fast and produce a lot of vodka in a short amount of time. Gins are in the same vein, where you really want your gin base to be relatively neutral, I feel, just so you can infuse as much of those flavors from the botanicals as possible. So I do recommend starting gins with a sugar base. However, it's pretty common for grains to be used as a sugar base. Again, wheat, rye, barley, something cheap that doesn't give too much flavor coming over. Your rum, aside from dunder, traditionally is made through molasses. That's really its only ingredient. For those who don't know, dunder is a type of rum that's traditionally made through some sort of bacteria, whether that's just like the spent wash in your last run or something as crazy as rotting goat heads and chicken bones, which, yes, that is a real thing. You can look up a dunder pit if you don't believe me. Anyways, traditional route for rum is molasses. Sweet, cheap, to the point. Whiskeys are, to be classified as a whiskey, pretty much it has to be done through some sort of grain bill. I've known whiskeys that are done through a molasses process. There's something called brown sugar bourbon, which is a phenomenal bourbon, but whiskeys are almost always done with grains. And the same with tequila. You can't have tequila without agave. It just doesn't work, right? And then brandy and schnapps. Typically, brandy is a distilled wine. And when you actually ferment fruit and distill that, that's a schnapps. But people get those mixed up all the time. So I want you guys to take a second and think about everything I just gave you. Think about what spirits you're looking to make and ferment. Because that's going to change the type of yeast we use, which we're going to go into now. As far as yeast goes, there's essentially 5 categories. We have our bread yeast, which is going to be relatively low yield, but a really cool, crusty, earthy flavor. Great for whiskeys. We have distiller's yeast, which is yeast specifically bred for this hobby right here. It's probably a top pick of mine. It gives you the most alcohol content possible and still a good flavor carryover. There's also champagne and wine yeast. I'd recommend this most for fruit in this hobby. Obviously, if you're a winemaker, use it as well. But if you're trying to distill, make a brandy or a schnapps or something, this is a really good bet. Turbo yeast is very fast acting, produces an incredible yield, up to 20% alcohol by volume, but there's some volatiles that come with that. So, vodkas and gins, things that need a neutral base, I do recommend them. You could also just get away with the distiller's yeast, but turbo yeast will just be fast, extremely high yield, and if you're putting it into a vodka and gin, which you're stripping of flavor anyway, give it a shot. And if you're really wanting to try it, you can collect your own wild yeast just from your backyard. I do recommend, if that's something you want to do, you look at videos on how to do so. There's a few out there that are very cool. George Duncan, Barley and Hops Brewing, did a great video on it. However, with that, as far as flavor goes, I don't know what you could produce with wild yeast. I would reckon that it's probably pretty low alcohol content, since wild yeast is definitely not bred or suited to that type of environment. But it could be a really cool thing to experiment with. One thing you need to consider when you're choosing your type of yeast is wait times. Obviously, with a turbo yeast, you can have 20% alcohol content in as little as 2 days, 48 hours. This is for people who generally just, want to get a run under the belt, or like I said, they're doing a neutral spirit and don't really care too much about their flavor. Don't have to wait too long. You can have something ready within 3 or 4 days. A gallon of vodka in 3 or 4 days isn't bad, right? Typical wait times are right around 1 week, sometimes into 2, with distiller's yeast. Um, Champagne yeast is also around that time frame. That's going to give you a nice mix. You're still going to get your flavor. You don't have to wait an awful long time. A lot of the time, keep in mind with fermentation, you're setting things in a bucket and then storing it somewhere and pretty much just letting it do its thing. So, put it in, put your distiller's yeast in, set your bucket aside, go to work for the week, come back on the next weekend, and everything's ready. Not too much of an issue, right? Some of that yeast will take a little bit longer, and let's talk about that for a second, because a lot of people prefer to make things last longer. So even if they're using a yeast that says it's ready in a week, 15% ABV in a week, they'll let it go. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I've seen up to a month. And they say that the longer that goes, the more things just sort of macerate in there, and you just get really phenomenal flavor. Now, I can't speak for this. I've never really waited for a fermentation as long as a month. I waited about 2 weeks at one point, and I did get phenomenal flavor. I still don't know if it was the way I ran the still, low and slow, with a nice copper unit, or it was the actual yeast doing its thing and waiting that long. So you can take that gamble if you decide. Maybe experiment. But I'd say, more or less, most of you are going to be in this category, the 1 week mark. Just as a quick rehash, for these spirit types, for vodkas and gins, I'd recommend starting with a distiller's yeast or a turbo yeast. There are specialty distillers and turbos yeast designed for certain spirits. We have a turbo gin here. We also have a turbo vodka and a regular distiller's yeast vodka. That would do quite well for you guys. If you're trying your hand at rum and even whiskeys, more than anything, I'd recommend a distiller's yeast. You could also do a bread. That's very cheap, but you're going to get a really low alcohol content, probably around 3 or 5%, as opposed to closer to 12 to 15% with the distiller's yeast. So you get a lot more of an alcohol content and more yield from your unit using a distiller's yeast, which is why I recommend it. Your tequilas are probably going to fall in the same category. I probably would stick away from the bread yeast and go right to distiller's yeast. And then for brandies and schnapps, my prime recommendation is going to be a champagne or a wine yeast, but that distiller's yeast can also get you. Now we also have a few things we need to look for when it comes to yeast. We need to pay attention to volatiles, which is what I was talking about with the turbo. As fermentation begins, you have a lot of different compounds being created. Esters, congeners, you have acetic acid, you have these different things coming up and boiling in this fermentation. You're also going to be smelling sulfur, which is a natural byproduct of fermentation. There's a lot of things going on. With turbo yeast, it's so fast acting and creating that alcohol that I don't think things have enough time to settle, I guess, in a way. And you generally get more harshness out of a turbo yeast. I will say that I've used turbo yeast with incredible results before. My favorite recipe I've ever made is a honey tequila. I used a turbo yeast for that, and that was probably the best thing I've ever made. This baby step bourbon is another one, phenomenal. And I did use a turbo for that. I know someone out there is probably looking to shoot me right now, but look, I did a turbo for my whiskey, and it came out top shelf as far as I'm concerned. Maybe I'm biased. So you can get good results for your turbo, and you can reduce that volatile by techniques in distilling. Run slower and lower. Run twice. It's through a method of stripping runs and spirit runs. You can produce a great spirit with a turbo yeast following certain methods. But I would say most people opt for a distiller's yeast where there's less volatiles initially, less work involved. Simply let it ferment and distill it once and be happy. Your bread and wild yeast are such a low alcohol content that you really won't expect much volatiles at all. Nothing to really worry about. Champagne and wine, I mean, fruit produces methanol naturally, so there's a lot of volatiles hooked onto that. Letting this champagne and wine yeast settle for an additional week or two past the time allotted is going to reduce that. Opening your bucket, letting those volatiles seep out, closing your bucket, letting it sit for another few days, doing it again, rinse and repeat. That's going to help you. Because keep in mind, that's also one thing with volatiles. It's not all about the yeast. It's also about what you're creating. Things like sugar have a relatively low methanol content, which means less volatiles attached to that. Grains are also the same way, pretty low methanol content. Really what you have to watch out for are things like fruit. When we're fermenting, another thing to look for are your temperatures. This is going to be the killer. I would say 80% of the people I talk to with fermentation troubles, something went wrong in the temperature. Probably the most important part, okay? What I recommend is whatever yeast you choose, look at the back of that package, see the optimal temperature. They should tell you what that yeast thrives best in, and follow that. The good news is when that fermentation gets a little bit colder than what's outside its optimal temperature range, you can heat it up a little bit and have it go back. It just gets dormant. When you heat it back up, it'll start thriving again. Everything will be good. If your fermentation gets too hot, you've pretty much killed your yeast and will have to restart your batch or just salvage what you can out of that fermentation. So temperatures are a huge thing, which is one thing we need to look at, and that kind of goes into location back here on Distilling 101. We don't want to ferment in a shed in the middle of winter with no climate control. Probably going to end badly for you. We don't want to stick our fermentation vessel outside in the middle of summer in Florida. Okay, things aren't going to go well. So we have to be a little bit cognizant of where our fermentation vessel goes and understand our environment. Sometimes I see that with even garages. I mean, a little bit climate controlled, but things can seep through that garage door and things can get too cold at night when you're sleeping and don't know, and things can happen. So pay attention to that when you're fermenting. I personally just shove it in a closet or a cabinet somewhere in my house, and I'm usually pretty good. Somewhere cool, dark, I guess less exposed than it would be just sitting out in the middle of the floor. And I'm usually good. When you're picking your bag of yeast, another important thing to look at is nutrients. Some of this yeast will have nutrients included, and some will need it. So a lot of the time, turbo yeast has amyloglucosidase attached to it. That's a type of enzyme that's specifically used to help that yeast thrive and grow, and that's why it can hit such a high alcohol tolerance. It's a blend of nutrients, natural minerals, diammonium phosphate, certain things like that, nothing extraordinary. But then some of this yeast will need it added to thrive. Distiller's yeast, champagne yeast will always need that added nutrient. And as far as that nutrient goes, it can be a list of things. You can get something really simple like diammonium phosphate, or you can go the all-natural route. Tomato paste is a wonderful yeast nutrient. Guys, I sure hope you enjoyed part 1 of the Distilling 101 fermentation series. We're going to have part 2 coming out next week. Wanted to apologize for any audio issues you might be seeing during this video. I was trying a different recording technique. I'm looking back and editing this now. Understand it probably is a little bit strange. Hopefully it wasn't too much of a hindrance, and I hope you guys are enjoying this series so far. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you are, and look forward to next week's video where we'll finish up this talk on fermentation. Thank y'all. Bye-bye.